Chapter 10, beginning in verse 32. We briefly got into these first few verses last week, but let's go ahead and read it again. We'll read the entire context here, verses 32 through 45. Mark 10, it says, "They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking on ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were fearful. And again he took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, 'Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise again.'" These first three verses, this is the third time where we notice Jesus telling his disciples. We see it beginning in Mark chapter 8. We see it again in Mark 9, and we see it again in Mark 10, where he tells his disciples that he is going to suffer and he is going to die. And here he gets very specific. And it's important to notice his foreknowledge. His foreknowledge helps us understand that he is deity, that he is the Son of God. He lists 7 specific things here in verse 33 and 34 that would happen to the Son of Man when he gets to Jerusalem. That number 1, he said he would be betrayed into the hands of the chief priests and the scribes. And we see that exactly happen as we get later on in the story. Judas hands him over. He betrays him into the Jewish leadership. He says in verse 33 that he's going to be condemned to death. And then he says he's going to be handed over to the Gentiles. Who is it that ultimately crucifies Jesus? It's the Romans. The Jews hand him over to the Romans to have him put to death. And during that process, he says in verse 34 that they will mock him and they will spit upon him. We see that happen. He says that he is going to be scourged. We see that happens when he is brought to Pilate. And then ultimately he says he's going to be killed and he's going to be crucified. And then he says the 7th thing, that he will be raised from the dead. All 7 things that Jesus mentions that are very specific happen to him when he goes to Jerusalem. And there's other instances. We're going to see a few when he enters into the city in Mark chapter 11. We're going to see his foreknowledge on display there also. But you see it all throughout the Gospels that Jesus, being God, has this distinct foreknowledge. And so we mentioned last week that they're amazed because they're amazed as Jesus is walking on ahead of them. As they've already told him, when he gets to Jerusalem, he's going to suffer and he's going to die. And yet Jesus is the one leading the way, and his disciples are amazed at this. And now with that context in mind, the following conversation is really fascinating to think about. Coming off of what Jesus just told them, we have James and John ask this question. Verse 35 through 45. Eric, if you'll read that for us. So I don't know how quickly this it's written back to back. I don't know how quickly this question comes after what Jesus had just told them, but no matter, the timing is somewhat close together. No matter the timing, it seems like an odd question for James and John to ask of the Father. They almost come to him like a little child comes to their dad. Before they even ask the question in Mark's account, what do they say to him first? Yeah, it's almost like a child, right? Whatever we ask for of you, can you do that for us? And then he says, what do you want me to do? And their question, which Matthew's account shows that it started from their mother actually, but their question was that they be able to sit at his right and his left hand in glory. This just comes after the story of the rich young ruler, which we said verse 31 really ties all these stories together. Many who are first will be last, and the last first. That's similar to what he says in verse 43 through 45 here. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. Jesus has been trying to teach them about the nature of his kingdom, and still they don't truly understand it. And in fact, this attitude that James and John has, it's antithetical to the kingdom that Christ is going to establish. The attitude that Jesus is really trying to get out of his disciples, it's still there, because that attitude, if they have that attitude, can the kingdom grow if his disciples have that type of attitude? It's not going to grow, right? Because they're just thinking about themselves. In fact, it's interesting. James and John, they were there with all the disciples, but do they mention the other disciples at all in this question? No, this question is for James and for John specifically, and we see that actually causes problems with the other disciples. But that's the attitude that is detrimental to growth in the kingdom. You can't be concerned about yourself. You can't be selfish. You can't have this type of arrogance in the kingdom of God. The citizens in the kingdom are completely opposite to that type of mindset. And it's interesting to think when you think about these specific men. When you think about the 12 apostles, and as we've gone throughout these stories, there seems to be 3 disciples that are with Jesus more, that are closer, right? And who would those be? Yeah, Peter, James, and John. When Jesus goes in and he raises the synagogue official's daughter from the dead, it's only Peter, James, and John with him. When Jesus is transfigured on the mount, who's with him? Peter, James, and John. And I just bring this up because these men, why they seem to be a part of this inner circle of Jesus, yet they still have their struggles. They still struggle with sin. We've already seen this many times with Peter. But here we see it with James and John. These men who were so close to Christ, and yet being that close to Christ didn't remove their struggles with temptations that they had. The Bible doesn't remove their mistakes for us, but it helps us, when the Bible puts those in there, for us to learn from their mistakes. Jesus has been teaching. We've been talking a lot about the nature of the kingdom when the little children came to him. What has he been teaching about the nature of his kingdom, or the nature of those citizens who will be in his kingdom? As it applies to the little children, why were they a part of the kingdom? Yeah, there's humility there. There's complete dependence on the Father. That's what you see in children. You see it in a lot of the miracles that Jesus has performed. We're going to see it in the miracle with Bartimaeus. It's complete reliance on Jesus. That humility is essential to the kingdom. When he goes to the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the gentle. That all gets to the idea of humility. And when you think about the nature of sin, when John describes the nature of sin in 1 John, what is a big part of the nature of sin? Really, I think it is the fountainhead of all sin, but those three things that he lists there in 1 John 2, what is the last one? The pride of life, right? Pride, essentially doing what you want to do, right? I think that's the source of really all sin. It's because pride says, I'm going to do my will and not the Father's. I'm going to do what I want to do. And so, even when it applies to the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh, you're putting your will above the Father. So Jesus, in his teaching, he's been trying to get this out of his disciples, but they still have it. When you think about the world at large, right, that's one of the defining characteristics of the world, is that selfishness, is that pride. I think it's the defining sin of humanity. And Jesus is saying that is what he's coming to give his life a ransom for. He's coming to save us from that way of life and that lifestyle. He's trying to remove that sin from us. And so he's going to take another opportunity here to teach James and to teach John and to teach all his disciples. And it's interesting to think about when these apostles, right, they have this knowledge. Obviously, they're with Jesus. They have this knowledge of who Jesus is. They've seen his miracles. They've been around his teachings. They begin to acknowledge that he is the Messiah and that they acknowledge that his kingdom is coming, but they still don't understand the nature. They have this discussion now, where do we fit within this kingdom? James and John, we want to be at your left hand and we want to be at your right hand. And that type of temptation, that's the way the world thinks, right? This isn't just a temptation unique to James and John, but it's a temptation for all of us, especially when we think about God's kingdom, because a lot of times, what do we try to do with God's kingdom? What does man try to do? They try to insert their own ideas, right? They think there's a better way to bring people into his kingdom, to keep people into his kingdom, and so they bring in their own thoughts and their own traditions. Jesus is clearly going to tell them in this passage again that God's kingdom operates entirely differently from the kingdoms of man. They do not behave in the same way. But to give James and John maybe a little leeway, right? What did they know about kingdoms, right? What was their experience? It was only these physical kingdoms. That's what they saw, that's what they knew, that's how they believed kingdoms operated. And the kingdom of God is entirely different, and Christ is trying to get them to see this. And so what's set up here, and when we think about, their question really is about what? They want to be exalted, right? They want to be seen as great. So they want to sit at his right and his left hand. When you think about how does one become great, we see two paths. One, we see the world's path, and then we see the path that Jesus talks about. The path of the world is what James and John were trying to do, this idea of self-promotion. Men often operate on this idea of carnal pride, right? To lift myself up, and when I lift myself up, then others will look at me as exalted or great. Jesus here, he teaches the exact opposite. That if you desire to be great, you must deny yourself. In fact, there's many verses all throughout the Gospels and the New Testament when he talks about if you desire to be exalted, what must happen first? Or what's the order and the sequence when it comes through the Scriptures? Yes, you have to humble yourselves, and it is, you let Jesus exalt you. That's the example that Christ gives for us. That's the second pattern. That's the pattern of the Scriptures, is self-denial. So with men, you see self-promotion. With Christ, you see self-denial. And that self-denial, that serving of others, that often runs against the grain of man's thought, right? That service runs against selfishness. Those two things battle against each other. Humility runs against our pride. And this way of service and humility, it's what is modeled by Jesus Christ. It's not what is modeled by the men of the world. And so when you think really about what James and John are asking, it's really very carnal. You may not see it that way when we first read it, but it is extremely carnal. They're asking for a type of carnal privilege. Not only that, they don't even ask it for all the other disciples, as we mentioned. This is going, and what is the other disciples' reaction when they hear of this? Yeah, they become indignant. That's also important to note, because what is the nature of selfishness and pride? What does that always cause? It causes friction. It causes problems. We see it clearly here. We see it if that is in the church with whoever, the elders, the preacher, whoever. If there is pride there, then that is always going to promote oneself, which when you're promoting yourself, it's going to cause friction and problems with others. That is the nature of self-promotion. James and John, they're oblivious to the other disciples and their needs because they're only thinking about themselves. So what they ask is it's very unloving. It's extremely carnal. It is not at all what Jesus has been teaching them from the very beginning of His ministry. And then not only do you see this selfishness and this confidence within them, you see an arrogant overconfidence when Jesus begins to speak to them. And when He begins to ask them this question, what is it that Jesus asks them? Yeah, somebody said it. Are you able to what? Yeah, what is that? So when He uses that language, drink the cup and be baptized with my baptism, what is He referring to there? Obviously, these are going to be figurative expressions. So what is Jesus speaking about in that verse? Yeah, that cup is that cup of suffering. That baptism, what is baptism? An immersion. What was Jesus about to be immersed in? Yeah, Jesus was going to be immersed in suffering and in persecution. He is this cup of self-denial also. He's completely giving of Himself to the point of this suffering and of death. And what's interesting, this gets to that arrogant overconfidence. What is the reaction of James and John? We are able. Why would they say that? What's really the only reason they could say that? Yeah, they're having a completely different conversation in a sense, right? They're thinking what Jesus is saying. They think He's saying something entirely different than what Jesus is actually telling them, because they still don't understand the nature of the kingdom. The only reason they can say we are able is because they don't know what He is talking about. In fact, they're going to show they're not able, because as this is the final week of the life of Jesus, when you get to Matthew 26, what happens when Jesus is arrested? Yeah, Matthew 26 and verse 56, then all the disciples left Him and fled. They would have an opportunity at that time, shortly after they said this. It shows they clearly don't understand what they were saying, because when Jesus faces this suffering, as it was prophesied, all His disciples, they left Him and they fled. But also in that, talking about this arrogance that they have, this selfishness, what else is that we are able indicate, what they're thinking? They don't understand what that cup is, but it also, their mindset is where? carnal. And it's almost like, just tell us, right? Just tell us what this is, and, then we will be able to be in that position of glory. We'll be able to be in that position of honor. Just go ahead and tell us. Again, not understanding what Jesus is speaking about. That cup and that baptism isn't about self. It's about self-denial. And it's about that agony that he's going to face. And it's about that death that he's going to face. And if they had understood what Jesus was talking about, do you think they would have even asked the question to begin with? That would have never came into their minds. We see, as we already saw in Matthew 26, they flee at the first sign of that persecution, at the first sign of that suffering. This gets back to, the sermon on evidences of the resurrection. How could these men who fled, who didn't understand the nature of the kingdom, didn't understand always what Jesus was talking about, when a cup of suffering was going to come upon him, they run away from that? Then what allows these men to completely change to where, as Jesus said, what did Jesus tell them? That they would eventually drink that cup, right? There would be a time. What changed their mindset completely? Obviously, it was seeing the resurrected Christ that changed their attitude and their disposition entirely. But back to the context here, Jesus, we talk about self-denial. Jesus is always the perfect example of what it means to be humble, of what our discipleship looks like. Jesus is about to do, he's doing the very opposite of what they're trying to do, isn't he? The question that they are asking. In fact, when you talk about the role that Jesus had, Jesus says, when he talks about to sit on his left and his right hand, whose does he say that is to give? Was it his to give? No, Matthew 20 says that it is for whom it has been prepared by my Father. Now we think about the nature of the Godhead. Jesus in his divinity, right? He's equal with the Father. They are both divine. But then when we think about the role of Jesus, in his role, what did Jesus do in relation to the Father? He submitted. He showed what it means to be humble. He submitted himself to the Father. Philippians chapter 2, if you'll turn there, this is what humility looks like, and Jesus is modeling this humility for his disciples. Philippians 2, verses 5 through 11. If you'll read that, Kyle Riddell. Yes. So when you think about what humility looks like, this describes the humility that Christ is trying to instill in his disciples. This is what discipleship looks like. This is the opposite of what they were trying to do. Jesus, in his role, he submitted to the Father. He said, "This is not mine to give what you are asking." They're trying to assume an authority that they do not have the right to assume. Jesus, opposite, he is demonstrating perfect submission to the Father. That conclusion there back in Mark, for even the Son of Man did not come to serve, right? Did not come to be served, but to serve. And we see that's what Paul describes in Philippians chapter 2. And this gets into what we were just talking about a minute ago, about humble service and the nature of the kingdom. When did the exaltation and the glorification of Christ happen? When did that occur, according to Paul here in Philippians? When was he exalted? Not a difficult question. What's it say there? Yeah, verse 8, becoming obedient to the point of death, even the death on a cross. And it describes everything that he did before that, right? He humbled himself. He left all the advantages and the privileges that were with him when he was with the Father in heaven. And he came down and he humbled himself to the point of humanity, right? He took on not only becoming a human, but becoming a servant. Not only being found in appearance as a man, but humbling himself even further to the point of death. And not only just death, it wasn't just an ordinary death. He humbled himself to the point of a death by crucifixion on the cross. And that's when you get to verse 9. For this reason also God highly exalted him. His exaltation came after his suffering. It came after he humbled himself to the point of death. Paul tells us in our life something very similar in Romans chapter 8. If we desire to be exalted one day by the Father, he says something very similar to what he said about Christ, that humility and even suffering comes before that. Romans chapter 8 and verse 16. Romans 8 verse 16. Paul says here, the Spirit Himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with Him, so that we may also be glorified with Him. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Christ, He suffered and He died, and the Father exalted Him and He glorified Him. Paul says here in Romans that if we desire to be His children, if we desire to be His heirs, he says, if we suffer with Him, so that we also may be glorified with Him. The sufferings that we face in the present time are not worthy to be compared with that glory that is to be revealed. There is that same order and sequence. Humility, the willingness to suffer for the cause of Christ, and that leads to glory. That leads to exaltation. That's the example that Christ gave for us, and that is the example that we are to follow. Because as Jesus, back in Mark 10, as He talks about this cup and this baptism that He's going to be baptized with, we saw already in verse 32, where is Jesus headed? He's headed out in front of everybody to face this suffering. He said exactly what's going to happen. He says He's going to be mocked, He's going to be scourged, He's going to be beaten, and He's going to be crucified. And He's heading on to Jerusalem to face just that. And it is through that suffering that He will be exalted. It is through that suffering that He becomes that ransom that He talks about. He pays the price so that our sins can be forgiven. So it's fascinating to think about this lesson that Jesus is teaching them here about the nature of this kingdom. He goes on to describe more about the kingdom in verse 42, where he says, Jesus said to them, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them, but it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give His life a ransom for many. He gets to, make the heart of where James and John were thinking. They were thinking like the king. What are the kingdoms that James and John knew? What are the kingdoms that they saw? The kingdoms that they saw, these men came into power through physical might. They maneuvered and they manipulated their way to a position of power and a position of glory. Jesus is saying in His kingdom it is just the opposite. That this is a kingdom like nothing that you know, right? This is that kingdom that was prophesied back in Daniel chapter 2 that stone cut without hands, this is a spiritual kingdom. This is a kingdom where the first shall be last and the last first. That is completely opposite to how the world thinks, right? When you see even the government, the kingdom that we live in, we see people claw and they fight their way to the top through self-promotion and just everything is about themselves. Jesus says His kingdom is about service. And if you think about those Gentiles He's talking about, if you think about Caesar, if you think about the Pilates, if you think about the Roman Empire, if you're thinking in that way, right? If that's how you're talking, then you're talking about what type of men are they talking about? When they're thinking about the kingdom, getting the power in that way, what type of men are those men? Yeah, right? These men these are completely fleshly minded men, right? These are men who are unsaved. These are men who have not come to Christ. These are men who are unregenerated. You're talking about the kingdom in that nature. He says that is not the nature of the kingdom. That is one thing that is entirely different. Christ, my kingdom, that kingdom that we read about in Daniel and Isaiah, that kingdom that Jesus has been talking about all throughout His ministry. We started at the beginning, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom that Jesus is talking about is one that His citizens serve one another. They serve God and they serve another. You think about all the other kingdoms, right? When you go back to Daniel, as we've studied, what happened to all those kingdoms of the world? That seemed, if you were to say at those times that Daniel wrote about the kingdom of Babylon or the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, if you were to talk about those kingdoms at that time, you would think that they would never be destroyed because of how powerful they looked. The same with the Greeks and the same with the Romans. You think those kingdoms would last forever because they had such a zenith of power, but it is that kingdom of that stone that was cut without hands, it is that kingdom that has endured since the day of Pentecost. Because as Jesus said to Pilate, when Pilate was questioning Him there in John chapter 18, and Jesus talked about the nature of His kingdom, what did Jesus say before Pilate about His kingdom? He said, it is not of this world. If my kingdom was of this world, my servants would fight. But His kingdom is spiritual, and He's trying to get His disciples to see this and understand this. His kingdom is eternal because His kingdom is spiritual. You think about this as you think about the kingdom, and then as you think about the church, right? Matthew 16, we see the kingdom and the church there. In that context, they're used interchangeably. And as you make applications then to the church and you think about what Jesus is talking about, as it applies to shepherds, He gives the admonition that's similar to what He says there in verse 42 about the Gentiles, that shepherds are not to lord over the flock, right? Shepherds, in fact, they lead through service. Elders lead through example and out of their concern and their love for others. It's not a position that is a physical manifestation of power. You're not trying to lord yourself over the flock. When you think about the roles of preachers and teachers, and as you talk about the nature of the kingdom, right, their role is to teach, to try to bring men and women to faith, to try to serve in that way, to try to nurture their faith. It's about service. When you think about brethren as a whole within the church, it's about encouragement, it's about love, it's about help, it's about service, it's about kindness, right? We see warnings not to bite and to devour one another. We see warnings about how we speak to one another. Again, that is the nature of the kingdom, and that is what Jesus is speaking about here with James and John and His disciples. And one more thing from this passage as we talk about what Jesus says to him there. He said in verse 44, he uses a very strong word here. He says, whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. The New American Standard translates that word slave, which is a good translation. It's from the word doulos, which means slave. And this gets again back to the nature of the kingdom. It's the idea of total dependence on the Lord. This isn't an abusive type of slavery that oftentimes we think of. That's not what is found in the kingdom. This type of slavery is actually voluntary, right? That we as His slaves, we voluntarily submit to the Master. We surrender to the King of Kings. But the good thing about this slavery that he talks about is the Master that we are serving. The Master that we are serving, right, is a Master that loves us, a Master that loved us so much that He gave His life to die for us. A Master, as we read in Romans chapter 8, who tells us that we can be joint heirs with Him. Well, that's different than many people think about the slavery that we find in the world. No, this Master says we can be heirs with Him. That was the first fruits, and that we can follow after Him. And it's a Master who tells us that His kingdom is not like the kingdom of men. It's a Master who tells us His kingdom operates entirely different from what we see in the world. So when you think about it from that perspective, we should not mind at all being a devoted slave to a Master like Jesus, to the King of Kings, to who Jesus is, and recognizing what Jesus did for us. So recognizing what Jesus did for us, we do everything to try to emulate that same character of our King and Master. And as he ended there in verse 45, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give His life a ransom for many. That's also interesting to think about, because in Him giving His life as a ransom, He's trying to ransom them and save them from that mindset that they are in right now. He's trying to save them from that fleshly mindset, trying to redeem them out of that slavery of sin that they are in to become a slave of righteousness, as Romans chapter 6 speaks about. So this is just another opportunity that Jesus uses to lead His disciples to understanding what the kingdom is about, as clearly they are still struggling to understand it. Any other comments before we get into verses 46 through 52? If not, let's read this real quickly and talk about Bartimaeus. Verse 46. Then they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. When he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out all the more. He began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many were sternly telling him to be quiet, but he kept crying out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said to him, "Call him here." So they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, stand up. He is calling for you." Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus, and answering him, Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabboni, I want to regain my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and began to follow Jesus. Another instance we see of the compassion of Jesus. And we see this compassion is displayed to all men. It doesn't matter what your status is in life. Because we saw earlier in Mark chapter 10, he had compassion on who? He tried to bring who to faith earlier in Mark chapter 10. This man didn't come to faith, but Jesus showed compassion upon him. Yeah, so the rich young ruler. So we have the rich young ruler, and now we have a blind beggar, a blind poor man. Again, Jesus shows compassion on all men. This is another instance where He shows compassion on those who are broken. He is concerned with all. He tries to bring all to the truth. Again, this story, it's going to fit with our theme that we've been talking about, the nature of those who are in His kingdom. Just as we conclude here, how were blind men, especially by the Jews, how were blind men viewed at this time? What was the thought about them? About their nature, if you will. Yeah, either they sinned or their fathers, their parents had sinned, right? You see that in John 9, 1 through 3. His disciples asked, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? That was the thought and the viewpoint about those who were blind. And they had this similar thought about this man. Because this story is similar. What did the people in the crowd again try to do? It's a similar story that we saw with the Syrophoenician woman and with the little children. What is the crowd trying to do with this man? Yeah, they're telling him, be quiet, right? Be quiet. Let Jesus go on His way. Jesus doesn't need to be bothered by this man who is blind. But we're out of time this evening, but we're going to see an amazing confession of faith, right? This blind man who can't see, but obviously, from what he has heard about Jesus, what does he call him? What does he call him? Rabboni, and before that, the Son of David. And to the Jewish mind, who is the Son of David? Yeah, the Messiah. It is the one who is coming to be king. This man, even blind, it has to have been from what he has heard. He recognizes this, and that shows a great statement of faith. Next week will be singing, and then the week after that will be the gospel meeting. So it'll be 3 weeks, but we'll try to begin there in Mark chapter 11, and that'll be the final week of the life of Jesus. We talked about in Mark how it's a quickly paced, but when we get to his final week, we see a change really in the literary style. Everything slows down, and there really is a focus on the final week in the life of Jesus. And I hope to have all the slides, or at least the majority of the slides, ready by that Wednesday. Thanks.